What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 262. I am Marshall. I am one of your Limited Resources, and I've got another guest host. You've become accustomed to this with me on the line. I'll introduce him in just a moment. Before I do, let's talk about Card Kingdom for a moment. CardKingdom.com, a fantastic place to buy and sell Magic cards. You can get singles there. You can get sealed packs or sealed products so that you can do booster drafts with your friends. And like I mentioned, you can sell your cards to them too. And it's pretty sweet because what you can do is you can sell them the rares that you open booster drafting. They'll give you plus 30% on your purchase or on your sale if you're trading them in for store credit. And then you can use the store credit to buy more boosters so that you can keep drafting. It's a pretty nice little system that they've got set up there. And, of course, if you're into Commander or whatever, you can get singles and stuff for your latest Standard or Commander deck as well. They ship very quickly. They stand by their product, and they have the best service in the biz. We certainly hope that you'll check them out. Of course, if you'd like to support the podcast more directly, you can do so via our Patreon. There's a link on lrcast.com that will bring you to the Patreon. And there's a video on there that explains how it works. And basically it's just a way to support the show directly. Certainly thank everybody that's done that thus far. All right. Our guest this week, I've been talking to him about coming on the show for quite a while, and we were finally able to make it happen. Somehow at like 9 a.m, I welcome Hall of Famer Randy Buehler. Hey, Randy.
Hey.
Welcome to the show. What are we doing? It's like 9 a.m. This isn't our normal thing.
Yeah, but it's like dinner time in France, I think.
So Randy and I spent over a week in France covering Worlds for you for Wizards coverage team, and we're not fully adjusted back to the time zone thing. I've been up for hours, and I never even get up. I usually get up around this time, and I've already been up. I watched a 1988 basketball game. I also watched some videos that you made, Randy, that we'll talk about near the end of the show. And yeah, I've had a full day, and I thought, well, let's just do the podcast while we're up.
Yeah, no, I set my alarm to make sure I was up in time for lunch, and then somehow I was up at 8.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at. All right, so Randy, let's kick things off in true LR fashion with a Crack-A-Pack. Let's do a Cons of Tarkir Crack-A-Pack. I'm pretty curious to hear, where you're at with the format. I know that, you and I talk about the formats a lot, when they're in their infancy, cause we're kind of prepping for PT stuff and trying to get some major talking points out. But then as the set goes on, we draft against each other in side drafts, but, I don't really have a great feel for where you're at with the format. And I think that Crack-A-Pack could be a good way to figure that out.
Let's do it.
All right. This one was given to me by Asturial. That's David Stewart. You probably know him because he runs the Limited Resources Cube on Magic Online for us. He has been doing that for a long time, and the guy's just he's a superstar, David. And thank you for the pack as well. I saw him at GP Ottawa. All right. First card out of the pack is Woolly Loxodon. Where are you at on the Wool Daddy there, Randy?
Yeah, I mean, he's nice to have around. Definitely one of the better morphs that you can get. I mean, he's the reason to have 6 mana in play. I'm not going to first pick him, but I'm happy to have him in my deck.
Yeah, that's where I'm at on him too. I mean, he's kind of the Trump morph, right? It's just he goes over the top of all the others. Next is Salt Road Patrol, which has been fine for me. Perhaps a bit defensive, but with Outlast, it can go into the late game.
Yeah, it's the kind of card that I draft, and I sometimes wind up playing, and I'm never actually happy when it makes the cut. Like, I want my decks to either be aggressive, coming out, 2-drop, 3-drop, aggressive 4-drop, or I want my decks to be broken. And he doesn't fit either category.
Yeah, he does seem a little bit lost. And for what's ultimately a high-quality creature, I mean, this thing comes down on turn 4, blocks everything for the most part. And then gets bigger in the late game when you need it to. I think maybe the downside to it is that there are a few morphs that they can run right into it anyway if they've hit their 5th mana and still run it over, which is a little disconcerting. I don't know. I guess it's somewhere like on the War Behemoth scale, right? Where it's like, sure, it makes the cut, but it's not great. What about Canyon Lurkers? Where are you at on that one? That's our next card.
Yeah, I'd be playable. I like the fact that even the bad morphs look scary when you play them.
Yes.
Right? I play a Canyon Lurker on turn 3, and who knows? It could be a Snowhorn Rider, right? It could be a Pine Walker. They don't know what it is. And so a lot of times people will use their debilitating injury just to take out whatever morph you happen to play on turn 3. Or, they'll attack into it with a 2/2, they'll block with a 2/2. And so Canyon Lurker, I'm not in love with paying that much mana for a 5/2, but the fact that you can play him as a morph and then trade him off, you often get a favorable trade just because they don't know that it's actually kind of only okay as morphs go.
Right. And
now,
go ahead.
Whatever. That doesn't mean we're going to first pick him out of the pack, but I'd rather have a Canyon Lurker in my deck than Assault Road Patrol.
All right. Yeah, that is interesting. I also have to say that I've been drafting sort of these Sultai, wannabe Secret Plans decks, and they live in fear of this stupid Canyon Lurkers because all my Monastery Flocks and Archer's Parapets just get gobbled right up by this thing.
Sure.
Next is Molting Snakeskin. No.
Yeah, no, I saw somebody play this card at the Grand Prix, and I was shocked. So now I'm starting to wonder if maybe it's playable, but I've never actually played it.
Who was it? I saw that too.
It was Jacob Wilson.
That is who it was, isn't it?
Yeah, it was Jacob. We had 2 of them.
I can't come to terms with that. I dislike this card so much that I was playing in a side event at an event that Rashad and I were covering, and I played Villainous Wealth for 7. And one of the cards I hit was Molting Snakeskin, and he took a picture of me with it saying, look, he does play it, and put it on Twitter. I'm like, I didn't even play it. He's like, you cast it. And I'm just like, come on, man. Yeah, he's just trying to get me. But no, I'm out on that. And same thing with Tygon Scheming, which is our next card. I just never found the deck for it.
Yeah, the thing is, the job of the Tygon Scheming is to fuel your Delve cards. It's just so bad. Right, being down a card isn't worth it. It doesn't do enough to enable sort of broken Delve draws. You can kind of see why R&D put it in the set, right? It gives people, you can't always get your hands on the Delve enablers that you want, so this is there. But it's just being down a card when you play it, the effect isn't actually worth putting into your deck, even when you're dedicated Delve.
Yeah, when I first reviewed this card, my thought process was okay, this card doesn't do anything, so it needs to make up for it in synergistic ways. And if you play this thing and you expect to get enough value out of it to make it worth it, you're going to have to be an all-in Delve deck. And at the time, I hadn't played the set yet, so I was like, I don't know if that's really a thing, right? Where if it's I just have all these Delve cards and all I need is enablers and I can just flood the board with these great threats. And as it turns out, it's not a thing. So,
yeah,
bye Tygon Scheming.
I think it could be a thing, except you run out of deck at some point, right?
Yes, you only start with 40. What are we going to do? I've heard of people adjusting, but right? Yeah. So I'm out. And interestingly here, the next card in the pack is another reason why Tygon Scheming is unplayable. It's Scout the Borders, which is actually a card that does something.
Absolutely. Scout the Borders is one of my favorite Delve enablers. If I'm in the Delve deck, if I'm in Sultai, I've got a dead drop or 2, whatever. I'm usually only in Sultai if I had a good reason to be in it, like Dead Drop or Necropolis Fiend or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And then you can always pick up a Hootie or a Scavenger. Then I love Scout the Borders. It does everything I want it to do. It puts a bunch of cards in the graveyard. It trades parity. It can fix my mana. It can go find the guy that I'm digging for. Actually, the Sultai deck that I drafted at Worlds had a Sagu Mauler in it. So it's not only am I enabling Delve for my 2 dead drops, but I might find the Sagu Mauler.
Yeah, which is also, any bombs you have certainly get better. I found that for me, Scout always is on that borderline. It's my 23rd, 24th card when I'm only playing 22.
Yeah, but that's because you play bad Sultai decks. If you only play Sultai when it's amazing, then you want Scout the Borders.
Yeah, that's fair. Because I think for some reason, I think that, Sultai Scavenger is just sweet on its own.
No, I think you and I draft from different parts of the card pool, which is actually really interesting.
It is interesting, yeah.
I think I default to being some pick 2 Mardu colors flavor aggro deck, and you default to being a sort of grindy Sultai control deck. And so, yeah, I think Scout is only really worth it if the payoff is there, right? If it's really good Delve cards. It's not just your run-of-the-mill. Scavengers is a fine card on its own. But it's not so good that it's going to drag me into Sultai. I'm just going to throw it into my Black-White Warriors deck.
Right. Next is Bloodfell Caves. So that's the red-black duel.
No, it's good.
It's fine. Yeah.
Honestly, so it's probably the first pick so far.
Yeah, we really have not had a lot to look at here. I guess Woolly Loxodon is the thing that's putting up a fight here.
Can I take Bloodfell Caves over Woolly Loxodon?
Yeah, you can.
One back one, I might.
Yeah, and Bloodfell Caves is actually one of the more important duels as well, just because there's this black-white warrior deck, which, by the way, you saw like week 1. Sure. I remember you and I having a chat about it and you saying, look, I think I want to be these enemy colors at their base. And this was sort of like you reading the set from a from a game designer, developer perspective, but then you figured out that black-white was the strongest 2-color pair of the bunch. And I've just found that in that deck, the red splash is a big deal. Like picking up just a couple of Ponyback Brigades and a Mardu Charm or something is really, really nice. And that means that Bloodfell Cave specifically, is the dual land that you want, that or the red-white one.
True.
Next is Jeskai Wind Scout. Where are you at on the Wind Scout?
He's solid, but unspectacular. I mean, I'm definitely going to be disappointed to first pick him, but I think that when you're in an aggressive blue deck, whether it's, blue-green with Savage Punches or blue-red can often be good. Like, I like having Jeskai Wind Scouts in my deck, I guess is where I'm at on him. I'm not building decks around him, and, like, you can't... Here's the thing about prowess decks, because I know you and I had this conversation a couple times back with this. We were trying to sort through the format. Mm-hmm. A lot of people build prowess decks where they've got, 11 creatures and 11 combat tricks. And the idea is that, well, most of my creatures have prowess, and I've got all these combat tricks, so it's going to work out great. And I think that's the wrong way to build a prowess deck. I actually think the way to build a Jeskai deck is with like 15, 16 creatures. And you want to be able to hit your curve. You want to be able to go 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, and then you've got, half a dozen, maybe 7 or 8 combat tricks, so that the prowess matters sometimes. But it's not all about the prowess. What you are is you're a really good curve beatdown deck that happens to have these combat tricks that are even better because of prowess.
Yeah, and that puts a lot of pressure on you finding cards like Jeskai Wind Scout, which is in that, sure, it's playable. Like, let's just say you take prowess off this card. It's like, okay. Like, I could see putting this in my deck sometimes, but...
Yeah, you drop it from good to playable if you take prowess off. And I mean, blues usually gets a better rate than a 2-1 flyer for 3, but, like, black would play that card.
Yeah, for sure. No downside. Are you kidding? Lens of Clarity is next. No. By the way, I heard something really funny about Lens of Clarity.
Okay.
Somebody said that they thought it was a genius design because you get to look at the top card of your library, which is what you would have drawn had you not played stupid Lens of Clarity. Which I thought that was really funny. Firehoof Cavalry.
I have actually played this guy.
And?
I mean... If you're aggressive enough, it becomes playable.
Is it like a raid enabler for you? Like, what's its role? Just being a 1-drop?
Yeah, it's a 1-drop. So primarily its role is to be a raid enabler, but it's also, if you're in the go wide deck, right? The only deck it's playable in is red-white. Like, you need to be able to activate the pseudo fire breathing ability to have it be, you're never putting in your deck as W1/1. But if you're specifically red-white go wide, then having an extra body is nice. Having a body that can enable raid is nice. You're like turn 2 Warname Aspirant is quite good when you pull it off, right?
Right.
So if you've got raid guys, I mean, and even just to get the War Chief and to get the Warrior token as your 3-drop, I want that deck to have a good curve. Like, I want to be out in front of the guy who's just going gain land into turn 3 morph. I want to be able to pressure that guy. So it doesn't make it good. It makes it, like, in the right deck, it's playable. It's also never a challenge to pick up and put in your pile. So
yeah, if you want one, you'll get one.
Like, I don't even think we're going to want this one on the trip back, even if we were that deck. Like, I'm still not even 9th picking it, but I have played it and not regretted it. And that's about the most, I guess it's the most left-handed of compliments I can give, right?
Yeah, that's about it. I do want you to tell me something though, because so people probably know who you are from the Pro Tour coverage team, from being in the Hall of Fame, being a Pro Tour champion. But it's been a little while now since you were in R&D and we're running that particular ship. But can you just give us a quick overview of your history with that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Wizards has always looked at the Pro Tour. I mean, both it's a marketing vehicle for them, right? But they also go to the Pro Tour to see what the pros are doing with their cards. And so I got to know Mark Rosewater back when I was a professional Magic player in the late 90s. And I mean, he eventually said, hey, you seem to have a a good head for the game, why don't you apply for a job in R&D? So I did that. I left the Pro Tour and joined R&D in 1999, and came in as kind of entry-level developer. Worked my way up the food chain fairly quickly. I mean, I showed up. The first set that was being developed when I got to R&D was Invasion, and got plugged right into the Evasion development team and basically worked on every set from Evasion through basically the Time Spiral block. As a developer, and then as the guy leading teams, and then I had the job Aaron Forsyth has right now for most of my run in R&D. I was the director of Magic R&D, which essentially meant that the designers and the developers and the artists all reported up through me. So yeah, I mean, I had the perspective of the sort of rank and file developer guy who was just working on the set and doing the play testing and tweaking the numbers. And then actually, I mean, one of the highlights of my career, I felt like, was Ravnica, where it wasn't me. Well, I think the set turned out great. Obviously, I think Ravnica is one of the highlights in the history of Magic. But it wasn't me doing the work with myself. It was the team of guys that I had sort of hired and put in place using the processes that I had helped develop.
Yeah, that's good.
So that felt really good. I mean, from there, I eventually got promoted out of R&D and started trying to help turn Wizards into a digital games company, which more or less failed. I mean, Wizards continues to struggle with its technology projects, so... Right. It's funny. I had a friend, one of the guys working for me there, who said that when you work in a treehouse, it's good to stay near the trunk. I probably should have heeded his advice.
That's interesting. Now, so what I want you to do here for Firehoof Cavalry is put yourself back in that rank and file developer seat. And we've got a 1/1 for 1 with an activated ability that costs 3 in a red to give it +2/+0 and trample. Could they have been more aggressive with this, with costing it? Like, what if it costs 2 in a red? What's the gap like in power level between those two cards?
Oh, I mean, they could have been more aggressive, but what you try to do is to have kind of a curve where, you can't have all the cards in the deck be aces. Right? You got to make some jacks, you got to make some sevens, you got to make some threes. Mm-hmm. The game is more interesting when the cards aren't all precisely costed to have exactly the same power level. And so, I mean, this is clearly not supposed to be a good card. It's clearly supposed to be a limited filler card. And I mean, I think that that's appropriate. There should be, you don't want your one drops to be super good in a world where you're trying to get people to play with 3 colors anyway. So, when I look at this set from a development point of view, I think they actually did a really good job of having the set be kind of a beat slower than many limited environments, having a ton of mana fixing so that you have time to actually play those awesome 3-color cards that you come up with. Morph helps as a mana fixing ability too. And so if you're going out of your way to make sure that people have time to get the mana to play their awesome gold cards, you don't want to have aggressive 1-drops that are beating them up before they can get there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Uncommon time.
Okay.
So here's some good stuff. First off, Chief of the Scale.
Yeah, I love him.
Yeah. So this is kind of your boy here.
This is the reason. The Chief of the Scale and the Chief of the Edge are the reason why Blacklight Warriors is such a good deck.
And this card just jumps to the front of the pack for us, right?
Oh, yeah, it's not close.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not even passing any good Warriors, which is even better, right?
That's right.
And sometimes you get a pack where there's a Chief of the Scale, but there's also like a Horde Chief and a Skull Hunter, and you're like, eh. But here we're not. I mean, the best card we're passing so far is probably the Loxodon, right? It's a green card.
Yeah, I think so. That or some people like the Wind Scout, but
yeah, fair enough.
It's funny that I just looked forward through the uncommons, and this is a very Randy pack. Next is High Spire Mantis.
Aha! High Spire Mantis is also very good.
Very, very good. Yeah. I don't know. It's similar. Like, is this, when you see High Spire Mantis, do you think Jeskai, or do you think, I could splash that in my Warrior stack just fine?
I think Jeskai.
Okay. This fits more into that for you.
I could splash in a Warriors deck, but not if I'm taking it over Chief of the Scale.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. I'm creating a Warriors player on my left if I take High Spire Mantis over Chief of the Scale. Also, I mean, if you are an aggro deck, you really want to be 2 in a splash. So yeah, I'm going to start. My default would be, well, if I take High Spire Mantis, I'm trying to build a red-white deck. I'm trying to go wide, and some of my reach is the fact that I've got this 3/3 flyer for 4 sitting, near the top of my curve.
Another Buehler favorite here, Dead Drop.
Wow.
Yeah. We've got Chief of the Scale, High Spire Mantis, Dead Drop for our uncommons.
These are all very good.
How good is Dead Drop? This has been a point of contention among among the pros and even on this show a bit of just, where does dead drop actually fall?
I feel like the pros have narrowed from some people think it's the best uncommon in the set and some people think it's unplayable, which is really interesting to have them there. Like even at the Pro Tour, right? The format was multiple weeks old and you could find people who said it's unplayable. You could also find people who said it's the best uncommon in the set.
Yes.
I feel like the consensus had narrowed to it's a very good card. Like I think you play dead drop if you have a dead drop in your pile and you have swamps in your deck, you're playing your dead drop. And you don't have to play enablers to get there because eventually you're playing a game of Magic, right? Creatures are going to trade, spells are going to resolve. You're going to eventually accumulate enough cards in the graveyard that if this is the only delve card in your deck, you're going to get to cast it for, 5, 6, 7 mana at some point, and it's going to be amazing when you cast it. I mean, the only time it's not amazing is when the guy has the red-white tokens deck, right? When they flipped a Ponyback Brigade and there's a bunch of tokens littering the battlefield. But even there, it's not terrible because... No. That guy is planning to, is planning to trumpet blast you at some point, and so you need to get his dorky tokens off the board.
Yeah, that's the line for me for in-betweener type cards is usually like, do I fall on the line of starting it in the main deck and taking it out if it's not great, or starting it in the board and bringing it in if I think it's going to be great? And that's a pretty firm line there.
Is that where you're at on Dead Drop?
In Dead Drop, I'm on the starting it for sure. Like I always play it. I never don't play Dead Drop in my black decks.
Do you sideboard it out sometimes?
No. And that's kind of where I was going with this, is that earlier in the format, I had Dead Drop in that same camp. Like I have Death Frenzy in that camp as well, where it's like, well, which one does it fall under? And so I earlier fell on Dead Drop on, I'm going to start it, and then if it's bad, I'll take it out. And then I never took it out. So okay. I'm just like, oh, it just must be good. And so
yeah, I think it's
now I just play them.
I have it a cut above Death Frenzy for sure.
Oh, me too. Yeah. And I just mean those type of cards, right? Mm-hmm. Like Death Frenzy is very, very good against certain decks and decent enough against other decks that you can usually maneuver it to do something. But I felt, for the example of Death Frenzy, I don't usually start it. I usually will bring it in out of the board in spots where I think it's going to be excellent. But yeah, if I'm even short playables a little bit, it'll make the cut.
I never wind up with Death Frenzy in my pile of cards.
You don't value it as highly?
Apparently. I mean, I never said to myself, oh, I don't like Death Frenzy. I just somehow never wind up with it.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. We have got a rare here too, Randy. It's a little bit of a step down from our uncommons, though. It's Temur Ascendancy. Okay. Which is not very good, I don't think. I want to like this card, but, we talk on this show a lot about quadrant theory, about, taking a card and putting it into the different stages of a game of Magic, from the developing stages to parity to when you're ahead and when you're behind. And Temur Ascendancy does not do very well on that scale. Sure. If you're in the developing stages, it's not actually like, it can be very good if you have other things to back it up, but it doesn't do anything on its own. Mm-hmm. And when you're at parity, it can help, but you really need those 4-power creatures. When you're ahead, God, I mean, I wonder if you'd rather just have something else. Like, this certainly keeps you ahead, but I don't know that that's, really so great. And also the when you're ahead quadrant is the least important, just because
right.
Almost any spell, right? Like, just show me a spell from my deck, and if I draw it when I'm ahead, I'll probably either stay ahead or get further ahead. And then when you're behind, this is a brick. It's just the most miserable thing that you could see. And when you're behind is the most important quadrant. And this one is a complete whiff in that one. So yeah, I find Temur Ascendancy, like, I've lost to it. I mean, I've definitely had somebody go turn 3 Ascendancy and then play like a 4-drop and a 5-drop. And I feel like I'm a full turn behind it all times. So it's not that the power level's not there. It's just so difficult to make it actually work.
Yeah, it has a high setup cost.
It absolutely does. Very good, Randy. Very good. But it really does. And another thing is, like, sometimes you play out your hand and you do your stuff and then you draw this card, when you're top decking and you're like, great, like, play this, go. And it just did stone nothing for, the whole game, basically. So
I will say, though, that the best time to draft Temur Ascendancy is pack 1.
Okay.
Like, if you get it early in pack 1, then you can build your entire deck to take advantage of it.
That is true. Alpine Grizzly it up.
Exactly. I mean, suddenly Alpine Grizzly becomes a very good pick, Canyon Lurkers. You wind up trying to accumulate more 4-power guys than you otherwise would. And I mean, I do think the draw where you get Temur Ascendancy into a bunch of 4-drops, you just get to roll the other guy over.
It's basically unbeatable. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if you wasted a first pick on that, well, not wasted. If you expended a first pick getting this thing, then you're right. It's only good when you're setting up. It's great if you get the right curve around it. So it's kind of an exciting card. I don't know. I have fun drafting around rares, especially when the stakes are lower. Like I would always do that when I was preparing for the Pro Tour. I'd go out of my way to draft the rare whenever I was in doubt and try to build around it so you could really see, how much can I leverage this, so that when I get the important draft that actually matters at the GP or the Pro Tour or whatever, I have more experience with these cards. So I mean, I've only tried building a Temur Ascendancy deck once, and I kind of had your experience with it, where I didn't draw it on curve, so it didn't do a whole lot. But I feel it's still an exciting deck to try to get. It's almost like trying to draft a Storm deck in Cube, right? You kind of know you're sacrificing value when you go for it.
Yeah.
But it's really fun.
And it's sweet when it gets there. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thing that has disappointed me the most about Temur Ascendancy is that when I first read it, I thought, okay, haste, that's very powerful. Like, you can basically keep your opponent from attacking you in a lot of situations because they're scared that you're going to drop something big and just crush them. But I was really excited about the creature for greater entering the battlefield drawing a card because it's kind of like an engine, right? Okay. Like I viewed that as, okay, the board's stalled out, and now anytime I draw an Alpine Grizzly or even like a Glacial Stalker or something like that, I just get to start chaining through my deck, and it's like, who needs secret plans, right? Like I can just churn through with this thing, and that's great.
Everything you said about this card also pretty much applies to secret plans.
Yes, absolutely.
It's just it's a little cheaper and it has a little more impact on the board. But it's not as powerful. I think the main difference, the big gap for me is that there are definitely scenarios where you top deck secret plans later in the game and still have a morph or two face down, and you can start to get that chain going. It's not a big difference, but I've definitely had that happen more often. I feel like Secret Plans is like a slightly better top deck than Temur Ascendancy. It's also just easier to cast, of course. It's also easier to get 10 morphs in your deck than 10 4-power guys.
Yes, exactly. Right. And that's the thing about the Ascendancy, I think, is that where it ultimately fell short is that it's actually quite difficult to get 4-powered creatures because the morphs are your 4-powered and higher creatures, but they cost 6 to cast, to hard cast, and that's not exactly what you want to do with a deck like this or a card like this.
Yeah, all I'm saying, if I'm drafting 5th out of this pack, right, all the uncommons are gone. If I'm already kind of Temur-ish, I'll draft this card.
Sure.
And then I'll try to err on the side of playing more 4-power guys, and if I manage to get a bunch of Alpine Grizzlies, then I'll play it. And
yes.
Know that, it's like I'll have some draws that are so powerful that it does kind of raise the expected value of my draft deck.
Yeah, I mean, it is a powerful card. There's no doubt.
It's a powerful card. I'm not going to first pick it. I'm not going to take it over any of these uncommons, but yeah, I would 5th pick this out of this if I was already in Temur colors.
Maybe even wheel it. I mean, there really isn't that many decks that want this card, and it's tough to cast as well.
Yeah, I mean, the pack's pretty weak. I don't think it'll be there on the wheel.
Yeah, that's true. All right, so what do you like? Chief of the Scale, High Spire Mantis, or Dead Drop?
This is a Chief of the Scale for me.
See, this is kind of your base mentality, right? Like you look for the Warriors deck and then sort of expand from there.
It's not specifically because it's the Warriors deck. The things I like about Chief of the Scale include the fact that it's a 2-drop, and include the fact that it's a high synergy card that I'm getting at the beginning of my draft where I can then draft around it.
Okay. And it's also not like, what's the difference for you between a 2-colored spell and a 3-colored spell on a first pick?
I mean, I'd rather have a 2-color spell, but I mean, there's not really a 3-color spell here to consider, right? It's the High Spire Mantis and the Dead Drop that I think are the other legit options. And I just feel like Dead Drop is very good, but I kind of know it's not the best uncommon in the set. It's not like, oh my God. I mean, some people might pick a Dead Drop here, and I think it's defensible to take a Dead Drop here. I think if your color preferences are really heavily toward red-white, and if you know that the guy on your right always drafts the Warriors deck, then maybe High Spire Mantis is a reasonable card here too. I just think that there aren't that many really quality plays that you can make before turn 3 in this format. And we talked about how when R&D was developing the set, they wanted to make sure that, the morph was the sort of base pace of most of the decks, and that you're not supposed to be able to beat somebody up before they can play their morph. Well, I like having 2-drops that are good in my deck because I do want to try to beat that guy up. I want to be on the front foot against the guy who goes Gainland, Morph. So whenever I can get good 2-drops, I want them. I mean, and this guy comes down, it's a 2/3 for 2.
Yes.
So it can both block morphs and attack through morphs. And that's before I even have any other warriors on the table. So I'm a big fan of 2-mana 2/3s in this format. I'm a big fan of starting with a 2-color enemy gold card. It doesn't have to be the Warriors card. It just happens that the best one in this pack is a Warriors card.
I think I'm going to take the dead drop.
Wow.
I don't know. It is definitely between Chief and dead drop for me as well. High Spire Mantis I've been thoroughly impressed by, but the red-white combo I'm not really looking to first pick over, you know, what's I think a better 2-color combo, which is the black-white. So the question for me comes down to color. Right? Like if I take the dead drop, if I think that it's roughly equivalent power level to Chief of the Scale, then I'd rather just take the 1-color card and keep my options more open. If I think that Chief of the Scale is better, then how much better is it? Right? And that's sort of the question for me. I think for me, the color thing does tip the scale enough in dead drop's favor for me to take it. So I think that's what I would take here.
You mean the fact that it's single color?
That's correct.
Yeah, I definitely am speculating by taking the Chief there, right? If I don't get black-white, then this pick is going to get... I mean, I might wind up with this thing in my sideboard, whereas that's a lot less likely to happen with a dead drop, right? Almost any deck I draft, I'm probably going to be able to at least splash in a couple of black sources and play a dead drop.
Yeah, that's kind of my thinking as well. I can go a lot of different directions with a dead drop.
Yeah, the case for Chief is really a case of the top end. Like, I kind of know how good dead drop's going to be. And like, if I get the Black-White Warriors deck, then this Chief of the Scale is going to be better than your dead drop.
Yes,
for sure. If I don't, though, then it could wind up in the sideboard. But it's pack one, pick one. And I know I'm not getting the Warriors deck if I pass this Chief, right? I'm essentially giving up on it. And if somebody passes me a third pick Chief in the third pack here, I'm going to be miserable if I pass that Chief of the Scale already. Even if I just get past Horde Chief, right? I'm going to want to be able to take what I think is the best of the sort of the most consistent, most powerful of the 2-color aggro decks. I mean, so I'm speculating a little bit. I mean, I think I'm taking a card with a higher variance than you are.
Yes.
But I think that, I think on average it works out better.
Yeah, and that's really the question, right? That's I think you've come to the core of the question. Is just like it's a risk versus reward thing. You're saying I'd rather take on a little bit more risk to have potentially a higher reward, and I'm saying I'd rather reduce my risk and take, and try to get my reward being, well, what else is here, right? Like I could take a blue card next, right? And I could take a green card next and feel fine with it. I could take a red card, right? And be like, sure, I'm in, right? Where if you take Chief of the Scale, it's like you're locked in a little bit more. But if you hit, your deck's going to be great. I mean,
I don't think of myself as locked in. The decks that play the Chief of the Scale only come in one flavor. That's fair.
Yeah.
But like somebody passes me, I don't know, Secret Plans or like an Ice Feather Aven or something. I can totally get out. I can just leave the card in my sideboard.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Good. That was a fun one. I'm curious to see what people say. I do one of those little straw poll things for each of the Cracker Packs, and I put them up on the website.
Sure.
So we'll keep an eye on that one. Maybe I'll even put that one up on Twitter. I thought that pack was really cool. Thanks again to David for that. All right. So I want to talk to you about actually a couple of things. Something occurred to me, Randy, while we were doing the Cracker Pack as well. I don't know how much you can talk about it. But the cube as well on Magic Online. Can you talk about that? Is that something you're allowed to? Okay. Cause for some reason it just slipped my mind, when I was chatting with you before the show about what I wanted to talk to you about, but then and I still do, but I was like, I got to talk to you about the cube. Like you basically have taken over, the Magic Online cube as far as designing it and developing it, right?
Not both designing and developing, but designing it. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I've been complaining to some of my friends in R&D. I mean, obviously I hired some of those guys back in the day. I'm still friends with those guys. I go play board games at Wizards on Thursdays when I'm in town. And so I've been complaining to them that I felt like they had been neglecting the Magic Online cube a little bit. It had gotten to the point where, there's some cards that they would just kind of throw in some cards from the newest set, and I just felt like it needed somebody to really take a pass through all the cards and make sure they had a good reason to be in there, and they agreed. And so I am now a consultant, I guess. I mean, I'm not employed by Wizards, but I have a contract with R&D to do, a number of things for them, one of which is to keep an eye on the cube. And so we started that relationship off this last summer with kind of a very thorough design pass. And so I went through, came up with a design. R&D devoted resources to play test the cube. So, I would drive down to Renton once a week. We would, they would sticker up the latest version of the cube. We would play test it. Tom Lapilli was the guy running the development side of that. So it's like my initial design and then Tom's development pass resulted in the cube, which is still on Magic Online as we talk about this. So I think it goes down tomorrow.
Yeah, I think so too. The 11th, I think which is tomorrow.
Yeah, it'll be back though.
Yeah, so you guys decided to brand it a little bit more clearly as well and go with the Legacy Cube. What was the reasoning there?
Well, I always felt like there's two cubes on Magic Online, and the Holiday Cube is the powered cube. And you see this split a lot in Cube World, right? There's powered cubes and there's unpowered cubes. And I think it's correct for Wizards and Magic Online to have both a powered cube and an unpowered cube. But I thought it would be useful to sort of separate them so you kind of knew which one you were doing. And a lot of the problems I thought with what used to be called the Magic Online Cube, what we're now calling the Legacy Cube, is that it had these kind of halfway implementations of strategies that really work well in the Holiday Cube. Artifact Matters is obviously an important thing in a cube that has moxes and signets, and you can have tinkers and tezzerets, and you can have all this stuff going on that takes advantage of the fact you have a bunch of artifacts in your cube. But the Legacy Cube didn't really have all those artifacts so I wanted to sort of separate it enough that it could have its own identity distinct from the Holiday Cube rather than feeling like a bad version of the Holiday Cube. I wanted it to have its own identity. The biggest casualty there was the Storm Deck, which Storm Deck works great in the Holiday Cube, where you've got a bunch of mana acceleration anyway, and you can sort of have a bunch of broken stuff. You can have the draw sevens. Chasing the Storm Deck in the Holiday Cube actually works. Chasing the Storm Deck in the Legacy Cube is this. Look, there are some people who love doing it, and I feel bad for having taken away a toy from some of those guys. And there are people who I think could even eke out like a positive winning percentage with the Cube deck. But it was such a trap. If you look at this,
it was such a trap.
Everyone who tried, the vast majority of the people who tried to draft Storm decks would just fail and wind up with these decks that didn't work because the support cards weren't in the cube. And so, and meanwhile, all the rest of us would just have these awful Storm cards cluttering up our packs with cards that were essentially unplayable. So a big part of what I wanted to do with that cube design was to try to clean up some of the chaff that was just cluttering up the cube with cards that you couldn't realistically play. Maybe there was exactly one deck they would fit into, but especially when that deck wasn't even a good deck in general, no matter how tempting and fun it was, I wanted to sort of clean that up. So we wound up shrinking the size of the cube so that we didn't have to have as many bad multi-lands to get the color fixing we wanted. We upped the gold count a little bit, and that was a super fun process. And on an ongoing basis, I think that another important part of this that hasn't really kicked in yet, but R&D agreed that it needs to pay more attention to the cube every time it goes out, and not go a year or two neglecting it so that it gets to that point where it needs a massive overhaul. But instead, let's look at the stats every time, and let's figure out what are the cards that are getting picked the lowest on average. Well, people don't seem to enjoy those cards. Let's just cut them and replace them with different things. What are the cards that the people who draft them just lose a lot more? Well, maybe we don't want to trick them with these trap cards in the cube. And so I do have this ongoing relationship with R&D. I have a contract moving into next year to be the cube guy, to be the guy looking at the stats and looking at the cube and trying to update it every time.
Oh, that's awesome. I think that your mentality coming in definitely mirrored a lot of what I heard in the cube community and the limited community as well, which is just, there were some cards in there that was like, why is this here? Right. And it was just something that just didn't need to be there. And then when the new cards would show up, it felt a little bit like haphazard about what was leaving and what was, what that meant. Because you know how these things go. I mean, there's archetypes in every cube that end up emerging, whether they are put there intentionally or not. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they go away. Now, when it came to, you guys made a few other changes that were interesting, I thought. One of them had to do with the swords, the sure. Sword of Fire and Ices and those type of things. You guys took them out. What was the reasoning there?
Yeah, it's tricky. I Well, so the reasoning was these cards are stupidly powerful and completely non-interactive, and games that involve them tend to just not be fun. One guy slams his sword down, and you either have the super narrow answer right now, or you don't get to play for the rest of the game, especially when the protection from color lined up. And so I feel like the only case for the swords is the fact that you have to put creatures in your deck because you need something to carry the sword. And I just like, no, let's just make creature decks playable on their own by not having a dozen Wrath of Gods in the cube in particular. And then, okay, you don't have to have swords to prop up the stats of the creature decks by having these crazy powerful cards that just swing games. So the big picture, we talked a lot. Do we actually want to curate out cards from the cube, or should it just be the greatest hits of all time? And where we wound up with was cube should be pretty much the greatest hits of all time. But, if a card is crazy powerful and also non-interactive, then we felt like it just wasn't fun to include it. So something like Jace the Mind Sculptor, also crazy powerful, but I mean, at least you get to play, right?
Yeah.
Sure, you're probably going to lose, but you get to interact with it, right? You might be able to attack it. You might be able to do all kinds of things. The person who is winning with Jace has a bunch of decisions to make. The game is it's more fun than your typical sort of blank and blank game.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And I always find it interesting because each of the cards in the cube carries some percentage of weight based on a multitude of different factors, one of them being power level. But other weird things come into play, like nostalgia, right? Like for some people just really love to play with these old cards that make them think of, when they first started playing Magic, or the good old days, air quotes, of Magic or whatever. And I'm assuming the swords, kind of have a weird juxtaposition there because they are so just absurdly powerful, but also people just seem to like them.
Yeah, it's funny. I get a lot of pushback, actually, when I would propose cards that were not nostalgic. There would be this, well, that's not a cube card. I'm like, I just want to create a limited environment that can stand on its own. There is a tension there because different people look to cube for different things. Some people want nostalgia. And so if it wasn't a constructed card back in the day, then what is it doing in this cube? But other people are looking for a sort of balanced, limited environment where they can do crazy things. And those are different goals.
Now, when it comes to checks and balances, this is something I'm curious about. You and I have had a chat about this already, which is mono red in the cube seems to be a sticking point for some people, and I'm one of them. I'm not a fan of having the mono red deck either be in the cube at all or be very good, but I'm also willing to look at it from a bigger picture perspective and realize that there are people that enjoy playing that type of strategy. I might just not be one of them. But the thing that occurs to me, and the thing that I find really interesting, and I'm actually glad that I don't have to be the one to make this decision and that you do or somebody else does, but is that while you do want to hit, these chords for all types of players, you want something for everybody, and you don't, just because I don't think that's fun doesn't mean that it's not fun for some people. Mm-hmm. There is this weird culture thing. And I had a Twitter discussion with you and Lapilli and a few others about this a while back, where, Lapilli was kind of saying, look, like, you can't say what's fun and what's not fun because it's different for each person, which is totally correct. That is the case. But what I was saying was that mono red didn't feel like cube to me. And, his response was something along the lines of like, well, how can I fix it if what you're saying is so nebulous, right? It's like, well, what does cube feel like? If you can't describe that, then I can't fix it. But the way I ended up describing it was like, I actually compared it to Commander, which is like when you play Commander, there's sort of these sets of rules is too strong of a word, but guidelines or like cultural guidelines from people about what you do and you don't do in Commander. And, when you play a game of Commander, the expectation is that you're not going to sit down and go like Mana Vault, key, whatever, and then just completely run people over on like a turn 3 combo. Like nobody in the Commander community thinks that that's cool or fun. And you'll probably just be, torched as a result of it. Mm-hmm. And I find that in Cube, there's something similar, though it's harder to put your finger on. But it's so interesting to see how many the big percentage of Cube players who just refuse to draft mono red almost on principle, even if it was like shown to them to be wide open whenever they wanted it and the most powerful, consistent deck in the format, they're like, that's not what I came here for. And I think I fall in that category too. And I was curious about how you guys have to manage that. I mean, you're trying to please a very broad audience here, but at the same time, like, there is something about Cube that is hard to put your finger on, but that isn't mono red.
Agreed. No, I mean, I think that you're right on all of those counts. It is a tricky decision for the reasons you pointed to. I do think there are people who like mono red, and I do think that it's appropriate to have an aggressive red deck in the Cube so that it isn't just who can set up the most degenerate, mid-game engine and all the games go to turn 8.
Right.
Like, I think Cube is healthier when there are aggressive decks, when there are creature decks. There's a white weenie deck with a bunch of Crusades that's clearly better now than it used to be.
It's really good now.
There's a mono black deck, which I'm not convinced is actually good. We could actually have a deeper conversation about that. I've got some crazy ideas about what we could do with black cards.
Ooh, I like this.
I think that the red deck is I think it's too good right now. I think it was clearly too good before. We made it, I think, weaker relative to the format. And the other thing that we made a real effort to do with the red deck was to make it so that there wasn't just one red deck. Like, it isn't just sort of this brainless Jackal Pups and Lightning Bolts deck. Now you want to splash green or you want to splash other colors, that there are more options in terms of the ways that you can draft red. That said, I do think that it's still too good. The stats seem to suggest that it's the most sort of powerful, most consistent strategy you can do. And I do think that there's a lot of people that want to have a little more time to be able to implement their cool thing that they drafted. And look, that's part of what Cube is. So I think the red deck should be there, but it shouldn't be this omnipresent force where as soon as your opponent plays a turn 1 mountain, you roll your eyes and start thinking about getting back in the queue again.
Yeah, that's pretty much my experience whenever they do. And I take some responsibility for it.
Right.
I realize what I'm doing is incredibly dirty, right? And like, I get that. And I should be punished for that somewhat. But like, it does feel like there's not, like, if I play against white weenie deck, the decks I traditionally draft get ranched by that deck, especially game 1. But I feel like I have some recourse. Like, I feel like there's things I can do to help shore that up. And with mono red, I feel like unless I picked up certain specific cards,
right,
I can't. And I just don't want to play that arms race. I don't want to play that game.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that one of the things I'll be looking at for the next update of the Legacy Cube is trying to bring the mono red deck down another notch. I'm not sure it actually came down as far as I intended it to come down this time. And, it's not that everyone should just have all the time they want to draft the dirtily decks. It's more trying to set it up so that it's balanced, such that the different strategies are in more of an equilibrium than they are right now.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting directions that you can go with this type of stuff as well. I was talking to Usman Jamil. He's a big Cube aficionado, does the Third Power podcast about cubing as well. And, one thing that he did and a few others have done is try to take what you'd consider like a traditional color or even color pair and take them in a different direction. The example that I have for this is taking blue and turning it into like an aggro deck or a tempo aggro deck, as opposed to the traditional, like, oh, it's all counters and, big fatties and stuff like that. In kind of exploring different space with, cheap evasive creatures and bounce spells or something like that.
Right.
And I wonder if there's a way that you can take mono red that maintains like its core identity of being assertive and aggressive, but maybe, has a land destruction side theme or I don't know, something that's a little
fun.
Slower. Yeah, like, I don't know if that's super fun either, but
I'd love to hear what it is. I mean, we had, there's wildfire decks you can build out of red. We had all 3 wildfire.
Okay, yeah, there's that, yeah.
For a while, and the deck just felt kind of weak. So that was like a late minute change. I actually think when we took out those 3 wildfires toward the last minute, they all got replaced with random lightning bolt type spells, and so the cube's a little burn heavy right now. I think that's part of what's going on.
Okay.
When we were doing this cube, we felt like we had an obligation to just do a good version of the normal greatest hits cube. I mean, because the Magic Online cube had gotten a little stale, we didn't want to do anything that was sort of way left of center or way right of center. There are themed cubes that you can do. You could do a tribal cube or a gold cube, or there's all kinds of ways that you can theme the cube that are interesting. our fear was that those are only interesting in limited doses. And in particular, we felt like we needed to make sure we got the cube back to just a good place. So we wanted it to just be a greatest hits cube. We wanted to make sort of the normal version of cube with this. That doesn't mean that Magic Online can't have a more themed cube or, take some of the colors in more weird directions. We didn't want to go there right now when we felt like, we owed it to the public to just improve the thing.
Yeah, I really like where you guys ended, by the way. I think that each thing is in a really good spot. I've drafted the cube multiple times, like tons of times actually, and I'm still enjoying it. I think that, you could probably turn the dials on a few things here and there to get it tweaked, but for considering that it's essentially a first run, at the new style of cube with the new restrictions on it, I think you guys hit in a really good place. And I agree. I think that best case scenario is that the Magic Online cube sort of gives you this thick baseline of like, this is what a cube is. Go ahead and build your own one drops cube or mono, whatever cube and have fun. But, I'm looking for the baseline cube experience when I come on Magic Online. I think you guys are really close to it. Also, I thought that a few people were a little unfair with you guys as well with some of the things that I actually found ultimately very interesting, which is that when I first came to the cube, I had drafted so many different cubes, but there were certain truths, right? Like Upheaval is first pickable and amazing. And in the new cube, there isn't quite as much, colorless mana fixing floating around. There's still, or mana ramp, excuse me. There's still enough, but you don't just get it as a matter of course, where it felt like in the old cube, it was like, if you wanted it, you could just get it because there was so much of it. And now that's not the case. And so like, I had to look at it. And at first I was like, well, this sucks. Like, Upheaval isn't good anymore. And I'm like, well, it's okay for Upheaval to be more narrow. Like, it's actually really uninteresting when, and Upheaval is the perfect example because I've had this happen a million times in older iterations of the cube where I've opened it and felt compelled to take it because it's like, well, I'm going to get the deck for it and it's ridiculously powerful and it's sweet. So I don't really feel like I have a choice here. Now, when I open up Upheaval, I'm like, well, I could take it now and then move in, right? Like absolutely prioritize those mana rocks and make this deck work. Or I could just pass it and I could take some other interesting card that before I wouldn't have been able to consider because you just had to take Upheaval. And I kind of like the new world now where like, let's just take those truths off the table, right? Like Upheaval doesn't have to be a first pick amazing card in every cube. It can be a card that you can play in some decks and not in others. And, it's made me, kind of reevaluate some cards like that. And I actually think that's better now.
Great. Yeah, no, it's definitely a card that's going to be better in the Holiday Cube too. We talk about that. Oh,
yeah.
Right. The Holiday Cube has not only the Moxes, but it has the Signets. The Holiday Cube, by the way, about to go online.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So did you work on that one too?
I did not specifically work on it. I mean, a lot of the, I guess, philosophies that I was talking through, like part of what I was doing with the Legacy Cube was carving out this space where the Holiday Cube could be distinct from it. So I didn't work specifically on the list of cards, but I feel like I was involved in that vision conversation. Okay. And moving forward, I actually will be included in the conversation about how to update it based on the data from having it go live.
Okay.
A lot of the reason I didn't work on it, by the way, is it wasn't broken. Like the Holiday Cube, I thought was in a pretty decent spot.
Yeah. Yeah,
it was doing the thing that it wants to do pretty well. So, the Holiday Cube hasn't changed nearly as much as the Legacy Cube, but that'll be a fun one. And then a lot of the other thing I was pushing for on the Holiday Cube was convincing those guys, there's more than one holiday a year.
That's true.
That was my biggest contribution to the Holiday Cube, was to get them to say, yes, okay, 2 times a year is just better than once a year.
I love that. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Okay, now I want to, while I've got you on here, Randy, I want to pick your brain about a different topic besides the cube, which is, you're in kind of a unique position to have been somebody who's really seen all angles of our game. I mean, you've been a Pro Tour champion, you've been a grinder at the pro level, you've ran the R&D, you've been in the booth for years, covering the Pro Tour. You've kind of seen it all from all different angles. And since we talk about limited on this podcast, I kind of wanted to get a sense for a little bit of a history lesson as far as limited went. I know that one thing that people that are relatively new to the game, even including myself, which I'm not relatively new to the game, but 5-6 years is when I came back to the game. The Pro Tours, I guess right around that time, went to split format, meaning that every Pro Tour had a limited element and also had a constructed element to it.
Sure.
And before, it wasn't like that, right? It was like you could just have one Pro Tour that was all, drafting or whatever?
That's exactly right. Yeah, for the first, 10 years or so, the Pro Tours would just be one format. There would be the Extended Pro Tour. There would be the Draft Pro Tour, the Rochester Draft Pro Tour, in fact, or the Booster Draft Pro Tour. And so what that meant is that you would get specialists. Like you could have a guy, a Rich Hohen, an Anton Janssen, a guy who was just one of the best limited players in the world and sort of didn't have to bother being really good at Constructed. Now, both limited and Constructed, it's still Magic. So, there was a lot of crossover, and there were people who would win in both formats. But it did carve out this specialty where somebody could be either a constructed specialist or a limited specialist.
What do you think about the difference between then and now? Now everybody's kind of got to do both, and I'm sure it's affected some of the players from that era who are still playing, who could no longer just sit on what they're really, really good at and have to push out in a different direction.
Yeah, that's basically it. I think that the change was quite healthy. I think it was the right thing for Wizards to do. I think that having a constructed format at every Pro Tour, it's just so much better from a spectator point of view, from a coverage point of view, to be able to sort of check in on what the pros are going to be doing with, it's usually standard, but whatever the constructed format is that people are playing, let's get a sense of what the pros can do with the latest set. So, going to split format, and also, the thing that's happened slightly more recently, but has sort of settled in now, is having the Pro Tours always be, a couple of weeks after the set came out. I think that those changes are super healthy for the Pro Tour, but it does mean that somebody like, a Ben Stark can't just coast on being an awesome limited player. He's got to learn to play constructed now. And, the people who are specialists, I think that it means their Pro Tour resumes don't look quite as impressive as they used to. Ben Stark's the kind of guy, he's in the Hall of Fame. He's clearly a great player.
Right.
But he would have more top eights if they were just all limited. He right now shows up for Pro Tours and he'll 5-1 the limited format, and then can he maintain that pace in constructed, or how close can he come to maintaining that pace in constructed? Yeah, and then on the flip side, you've got guys like Shota Yasaoka, who's not in the Hall of Fame, who I think if there were pure constructed Pro Tours, because he's a guy who I think is just better at constructed, he might have the top eights that he needs to get into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and I think that's a super interesting distinction. Now, you mentioned the team limited events of the past. Can you talk to us about those a little bit for people that aren't familiar with how those went?
Sure. The initial there were Team Pro Tours back in the day, and the format that was used for those Team Pro Tours was Team Rochester Draft. So before we even talk about teams, let's just talk about Rochester Draft, because that's a format that basically doesn't ever happen anymore. The way a Rochester Draft works is, unlike Booster Draft, where you sort of open up your pack in secret and make your one pick and pass it to the guy on the left, in Rochester Draft, you take turns opening up your pack and you put it face up on the table.
Oh, God.
So all 15 cards go face up on the table, and then while everyone is watching, you first pick a card, and then the guy on your left picks a card, and then you do the normal wheel around the table. It's just that you have to do that 24 times to get through everybody's 3 packs, right? So you wind up with the same cards you would wind up with in a booster draft. You've just done it all face up, and everybody gets to see what everyone around them is drafting.
Wow. Now, so what's the dynamic like then? I know that in a regular booster draft, our goal is essentially to work together with the people around us so that we can get the best deck possible, but we can't obviously talk to them about it. Here, it's like you can just see what the person's doing. Does everybody just end up playing nice?
The correct strategy is definitely to play nice. And the thing that doesn't happen in normal booster draft is, like in normal booster draft, I don't get to influence the guy on my right, right? I kind of have to submit to whatever the guy on my right is telling me I'm allowed to draft, right? He tells me, here are your colors, and I'm like, okay, I guess that's what I'm going to do. You don't have the ability to really influence him. When it's face up, though, you kind of do. Like, you get signaling becomes way more important in a Rochester draft. I might be drafting 7th in the pack, but like, I get the chance. It actually means that the first guy who opens the very first pack is in a mediocre seat, because sure, he gets to first pick a card, but then everybody else gets to kind of signal their color preferences with the 4th picks and the 7th picks and the 8th picks, and it actually bounces and circles back. So like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The 8th place guy in the pack also drafts 9th, and then it bounces. So the guy who took the 7th pick out of the pack also takes the 10th pick out of the pack. And it goes back to where the guy who drafted 2nd is going to also get the 15th card. So over the course of all those picks, you get to signal color preferences with crappy cards that normally wouldn't help you signal at all. But because it's face up and because people can see that you went out of your way to take 2 crappy green cards on the wheel, I guess you really care about green. Maybe I won't play green near you.
Now that creates an interesting dynamic though, right? Like, what happens when 2 stubborn people get next to each other in that scenario and say, well, you're making a move towards green, but you know what? I'm going to take green.
Yeah. On the one hand, it's the same thing that happens in the normal booster draft where they both lose. But on the other hand, it's face up. So now they're actually angry at each other. They know who they're fighting with. They know who to be angry with and yell at after the draft. It's really interesting. It's definitely a skill testing format. The Grand Prix that I won was actually a Rochester draft Grand Prix. And
who were you with for that?
It was Grand Prix Atlanta in 1998. I remember David Mills, who's the guy I beat in the finals of my Pro Tour, was across the table from me in the 4 seat, and I was in the 8 seat. And the first pack came out, and he signaled green in the 4 seat, and then so everybody behind him kind of got out of the way of green. And I was able to be the only other green mage in the 8 seat. And so I was directly across the table from him. And he and I essentially staked out green with these early signaling. And it was a Tempest, full Tempest block format where green was actually kind of decent. And that really helped. Like, I was able to get green, and then I wound up with a pretty solid green black deck that, because I could watch who was drafting what colors where, I was able to just identify the underdrafted color early enough to stake my claim for it, and then nobody near me wanted to fight, and so David and I wound up just having these really awesome green decks.
Now, do players, like, do they hate draft from each other, or do they, like, because I'm assuming that if you can track that type of information, I mean, you kind of know what everybody's doing, right? Like, by the time you're done, you've seen every pick. Absolutely. So he's in red blue and he's in green red. And do you take cards that either they want or that are especially good against them higher?
You tend not. Well, hate drafting happens, I think, even less than it happens in booster draft. Like, it doesn't happen much in booster draft. It happens even less in Rochester, because if I hate draft from you, then that's just going to incentivize you to hate draft from me. And there's more packs coming. Like, it's only at the very end of the draft where it even becomes tempting where it even becomes useful to try to take away a card. I actually got super mad at a Worlds Rochester draft. Sigurd Eskelund, who is this guy I was actually playtesting with for the tournament. He and I had taught a class at a Magic camp like earlier in the summer, and I was in there was this dorky red 2/1. It was like one in a Goblin Mason, I think. One in a red for a 2/1. It had some ability to, like, you couldn't block it with walls or the walls would die or something. Just like a random 2-drop that I needed to fill out my curve. So I was drafting 7th out of the pack, and I took some other card planning to just kind of bounce the Masons off of him and draft it 10th. And he de-drafted it from me.
No.
Like, what are you doing? Like, we're teammates, we're working together, and it's actually the only warning I got in my Pro Tour career. As soon as the draft was over, I looked at him and I'm like, F you if you think you're getting my extended deck, and like stormed off.
Oh man.
Totally tilted me. I mean, it's my fault for going on tilt, right? I 0-6'd from 6-0 at Worlds Day 1. I 0-6'd that day.
That's insane.
Well, de-draft, you didn't de-draft. Like,
that's just, it seems like completely out of line for him to do that.
I mean, in general, you cooperated in Rochester draft, and especially like somebody you've been testing with and like a teammate for the sake of the event. Oh yeah, I was not happy.
Wow, I wouldn't be either. Now, what about Team Rochester? This is something that sort of gets brought up in hushed tones, but it seems like a pretty complex format too.
So Team Rochester is just like the Rochester I described, except there's 6 of us at the table, and there's 3 of us on one side of the table that are on one team, and then 3 of you on the other side of the table that are the other team. And the way the matches would be played is we would do a draft, and then we would play one match where you played across. So like you would play the guy across from you, and then whoever won 2 of those 3 matches wins the match.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the way Team Sealed works now from a gameplay and a match and round scoring point of view, right? You sit down with your 3, and if 2 of your guys win, then you win the match and get the credit. But Rochester drafting those decks ahead of time means, now we talked about how Rochester's face up, right? You know what everybody's drafting, and you can kind of react to that a little bit. In Team Rochester, not only do you know what everybody's drafting, you know who's playing whom. So all of a sudden, like, sideboard cards become huge. And you're like, that, 2G, 2/2 Forest Walker, if you're playing against the other green guy, that is main deck all day. And so you've got all the skill of Rochester draft where you're keeping track of all the cards and trying to position yourself. And the other thing is because you and your teammates are sitting in a row, like when it comes to your pick, you get to basically decide who gets to draft the bomb, because I have a pick and then you have a pick and then our third teammate has a pick.
Oh, so it doesn't alternate between teams, the picks.
Correct. It does not alternate picks. 3 in a row, 3 in a row. You and your teammates are sitting next to each other, which allows you to essentially, deal out the cards. Like sometimes it'll be bouncing and your team's only going to have one guy take a card before it goes back to the other team. But sometimes you can just decide which of the three of us wants to take this bomb rare, which is super cool. But the real skill in the format was understanding the matchups and understanding, all right, they've put their red-green beatdown player there. Therefore, the guy we have playing against him should be whatever, blue-white with a bunch of walls or a bunch of sideboard cards. And that art of understanding the matchups so that you could just win the matchups by where you put your decks and how you drafted the decks specifically against that one known opponent was super skill testing.
Wow, that sounds complicated too.
Yeah, but I mean, it is complicated, but it's very skill testing. And so, Kai Buddha won multiple Pro Tours in this format. Mike Turian won in this format, and just every team Mike was on seemed to make the top 4, no matter who his teammates were. It was definitely a format that rewarded, and there were people who were just incredibly good at that specific format. And it was a very skill testing format, for whatever that's worth.
What was the mentality like for limited players back then? I mean, this podcast and there's other sources of information have really tried to push the collective mentality forward as far as, basic gaming stuff like not being results oriented and how to, view your information and be logical about things. And then down to more specific, limited and draft related things about, cards, like we were talking about the quadrant theory earlier, when do cards affect the board? How does that affect, when you're going to play them and take them and how powerful they are? I mean, this kind of stuff wasn't really around, back then. Was there just sort of an innate understanding of this, or was it a rougher limited environment?
How far back do you want me to go?
I mean, like when you were playing on the Pro Tour.
So when I was playing on the Pro Tour, like Gary Wise kind of made his reputation by being the one guy who had an article series on the internet that was talking about draft picks. Wise Words was the column. And I mean, I think that column was a lot of the reason Gary wound up getting voted into the Hall of Fame. So he would be the guy who would be talking about, okay, here's pick orders. So limited tech didn't evolve much beyond pick orders back in the 90s, say. But I mean, Garrett, there was an article for, a Pro Tour guy who's now a Hall of Fame guy saying, here's what you take ahead of what, and here's why. So that helped. The biggest difference, honestly, was that Magic Online didn't exist. And so it was really hard to get the reps in, right? You needed a group of guys who were pretty good at Magic to actually have a draft. Like you
in
had
the same area and all that.
Right. You had to have a local store, or you had to have like a team of guys who were going to get together on campus or somewhere just to get a draft going. You couldn't just hop on your computer because Magic Online didn't exist. And what that meant was the people who did get the chance to draft regularly, like the people who had half a dozen Pro Tour quality players in the same city, had this gigantic edge over the rest of the field. I don't think the best drafters in the world are any better or any worse now than they were 15 years ago. But the edge that you could get over sort of the average Pro Tour player was way bigger back before the average Pro Tour player could always find a draft on Magic Online.
Wow, that's super interesting. Yeah, I can't even imagine it, to be honest. Like, I take that part for granted that, before you and I go on the air on a Pro Tour morning, that I'm going to at least get my hands on 10 or 12 drafts before I'm even in the booth so that I can have relevant talking points and have, acquainted myself with the format enough to at least talk to it.
It used to be the way the top players got their edge, was that they could do that and other people couldn't.
Wow, that's insane.
I mean, you talk about taking things for granted. You go back even further and I remember the draft format and the guys from California who taught the world to beat down, right? It didn't used to be that you would play 2-mana, 2-power guys and just turn them sideways. Like attacking for 2 was essentially invented in 1997 by Brian Hacker and Truck Bowie and John Yu. These guys out of California just showed up to the Pro Tour and they're like, forget about these dirtily controlled decks, man. We're coming out. It was like Mirage Visions, and they're playing, 2-drop, 3-drop mana curves, flanking creatures, attacking, combat tricks to force their guys through. That they essentially invented that strategy around about season 2 of the Pro Tour, and then they all top 8'd all the limited Pro Tours that year.
Wow, we just call that limited now.
Right? No, exactly. Somebody had to invent it.
That's crazy.
And I mean, a lot of that too is that Wizards started making better sets. In particular, Wizards started making sets specifically for limited. You ever go back and play Ice Age limited, and there aren't any creatures to attack with.
Yeah.
You win Ice Age limited by attacking with a 1-power flyer for 20 turns.
Oh my God.
There's all these walls, and there aren't enough creatures in the set in the first place. And so, Mirage was really the first block where they even considered it, and, where it started to feel like, okay, you can actually attack and beat down. And I mean, hat tip to those guys for figuring it out first. I mean, the rest of us were still in Ice Age mode where, yeah, you need one evasion creature and then you defend it for 20 turns. Like literally you would splash a color for a 1-power flyer in Ice Age.
That's insane.
Right.
And then, by today's standards.
Right. And then by Tempest, it was clear that they were thinking about limited. And, Tempest was a very aggressive format with shadows. And they had this nice tension between shadows being the aggressive creatures and buyback being the degenerate thing you could do when you had a bunch of mana in play. I mean, that's really where Wizards started to develop sets with sealed and draft in mind. But I mean, they'd still do things like Urza Saga had Pestilence as a common. And also, oh, by the way, had Expunge and Corrupt and Befoul and a bunch of flyers. And the rule in Urza block, Urza Saga in particular, here was my rule. Somebody at the table is not going to draft black. Okay. Don't let it be you.
Oh my God, are you serious?
Yeah, the balance was just radically.
Oh, that's brutal.
So over the course of the 90s, you could kind of see that. And then one of the things Wizards figured out, it needed to hire people off the Pro Tour that understood the game at that top level and can just help build them a development process so that sets would be more balanced both for limited and for constructed.
And that ended up being you.
I was the first guy they hired in and then helped kind of build those processes and hire in a steady stream of Pro Tour players that you still see getting hired to this day.
So after they started developing towards limited more and started kind of figuring out those major things like, well, maybe we shouldn't make one color, this much better than the rest. And we need more creatures that can attack and block, for those sort of in-betweener cards for the set.
We need to not have Fireball at common. Yeah, stuff
yes,
like
that. not that. What would you say the biggest difference is from after the dust settled on that to now? I've noticed in my time, for example, that there aren't quite as many, we call them skill testers, right? Cards that are just patently horrible that you just never would play. It seems to be that the cards have merged a little bit more towards the middle, and also just that they're more powerful in general. What for you is, what have you seen as some of the more important developments since then?
I think that the biggest tech in the last, 5 years or so is that Wizards is clearly thinking about every 2-color pair of cards and trying to figure out, why would you draft this color pair? And so it's almost like they look at every set, and I mean, sometimes it's more obvious and sometimes it's less obvious, and it doesn't apply so much to cons, which is a 3-color set, but what is the blue-green deck in this format? What is the red-white deck? And so they go out of their way to try to design sets such that they have sort of open enough mechanics in each of the colors such that they pair in interestingly different ways. I mean, it used to be you would just, okay, the set's got a spell mechanic and a creature mechanic and a flavor theme, and we sort of pay that off in all the ways that we can. And we try to balance the colors. Okay, good enough. But now they've really gone out of their way to look in particular at the 10 2-color pairs and try to make sure that there's something interesting going on and something different going on with each of the 2-color pairs.
Yeah, that I have noticed that too. The times when it's the clearest are when, on Modern Masters and Vintage Masters, specifically Vintage Masters, where they're making a set for limited specifically. It doesn't have any connotation for constructed directly. So they're just here's a limited set, and you let some of the modern day developers go on that. And that's exactly how they pare it down. They're just and they've even gone a level deeper where it's here's all the 10 2-color pairs and what we kind of had as idea for the baseline on these. But then there's also sub themes within each one as well that you'll pop up with. There's a couple of uncommons, and if you pick up a pair of these, then all of a sudden you can be in this deck, which is actually quite a departure from the base one. An example would be Red, White, and Vintage Masters tends to be an aggressive token type deck. But if you pick up Astral Slide and Lightning Rift, you're going in a completely different direction than that deck, yet you're still Red, White.
No, that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely most pronounced in Vintage Masters and Modern Masters.
But you're seeing this in the regular sets as well, just not quite as
like
clear.
I think in M15 they went out of their way, like they don't want every draft format to feel like you're on rails. You're like, oh, I'm in this 2-color combination, therefore I have to draft these things. But M15 I think does a good job of having these little hints of synergy. And okay, green white is best when it's a convoke deck, but like there's a black white life gaining deck that you can kind of sort of sometimes get if you get the right uncommons. But you can't count on getting it the way you could in, Vintage Masters. You can count on there being a ton of cycling cards if you wind up in the cycling deck.
Right.
So, I think that I like the way that they're ebbing and flowing how high the bumpers are. I don't know how much on rails you are when you're in those 2-color combinations.
I like it.
But that's definitely, I think that's the modern limited tech from an R&D point of view is them playing around with this idea of the 10 2-color pairs and why would you draft each of them.
Okay. I like that. I think that makes for a much more well-rounded limited environment. So we've been talking about the history, and before I let you go though, Randy, I did have something else I wanted to bring up to you, which I think is really cool that you've been doing. It's not limited specific. In fact, it's constructed specific, but I still think it's really cool. And it's called Gauntlet of Greatness. And it's a project that you're doing with our friends over at Card Kingdom and their mocksportinghouse.com website that they've recently put up. Can you talk to us a little bit about Gauntlet of Greatness?
Sure. I think the website's worth talking about too, because I'm not sure how many people have noticed this, but with Card Kingdom expanding into Bellevue, they've opened up a new store. It's actually it's almost walking distance from my house. So I'm very happy to not have to drive to Ballard now in order to go to a Card Kingdom store.
That's nice.
But yeah, in conjunction with that store, they've launching Mock Sporting House as a website, and they want to have a content website. Like it's not just the store's About Me page so much as it is content. And so, they came to me to see if there was something I thought would be, not just your average run of the mill, here's draft videos or, here's what people should be playing in standard right now, but something sort of a little more, I don't know, eccentric. I'm not sure what the right word is. Mm-hmm. But I've had this idea for a while of taking the best standard decks from the history of Magic and sort of fighting them off in a tournament. And so the Gauntlet of Greatness is essentially a tournament to figure out what's the best standard deck of all time.
This is so cool.
No, I love thinking about stuff like this. And so it's like, okay, the Tolarian Academy deck from back in the Broken Combo days versus a Jace the Mind Sculptor deck versus, the Blue-Green Madness deck. Or, there's all these different boogeyman decks, the Affinity deck, the Necro deck. There's all these decks from the history of Magic that, people who were playing kind of remember, or maybe people who weren't playing have sort of heard about. And so, I built essentially a 16-deck tournament. I'm running it almost like a World Cup soccer tournament where the 16 decks have been divided up into 4 pools of 4 decks each. You play round robin inside the pool, and then the top 2 decks go to the single elimination bracket at the end. So it means that every deck, I'm going to play it at least 3 times, and then 8 decks will go to the playoffs, and we'll figure out who wins. So the first episode just went live. It was Pool A, so it was Academy versus Psychotog, and Affinity versus Rebels. Those are the 4 decks that are in Pool A. And then next week, the first matches from Pool B will go up, and et cetera. It'll take. I figured out it's basically a 12-week regular season. Yeah, it's a 12-week regular season, and then we'll get to the playoffs.
I'm obviously not going to spoil anything, but I've already watched. I've already watched these, and the Academy versus Psychotog matchup was particularly interesting to me. I think it's one that you'll want to check out for sure. Just get to see some of the raw power of these older decks. It is unbelievable what's some of the things that those decks can actually do.
Yeah, no, it should be
fun. So if people wanted to say hi to you, or to get a hold of you or to find your stuff, where can people find you on the net?
Twitter's the best. I'm R. Buehler on Twitter. And so, there's Vintage Super League has its own website at this point. I might have a YouTube page with a lot of Vintage Super League videos, and I'll start putting the Gauntlet of Greatness videos there eventually. But yeah, Twitter is sort of the place where whatever I'm doing, I'm gonna wind up throwing up a tweet saying, "Hey, go here, look at this new cool thing I've been up to."
All right. Well, I'll make sure to put a link to the Gauntlet of Greatness videos, to the VSL, and of course to your Twitter in the show notes as well. Randy, thanks for taking the time to join us, especially on such short notice.
Oh yeah, this was fun.
I'm sure we'll have you back on. Don't worry. If you guys want to find me, you can do so on Twitter, Marshall_LR. If you'd like to send an email for feedback, you can do so lr@lrcast.com. And if you want to join the clan on Magic Online, it's quite easy. You just have to send me a message when I'm on there. The only rules for getting in the clan are that you got to love Magic and you can't be a jerk. If you meet those relatively simple criteria, just shout out there on Magic Online, and I'll get you an invite. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.